On the morning of the 19th of August 1942, at precisely 5:20 a.m., the first wave of Allied troops approached the beaches of Dieppe, a quiet French coastal town occupied by German forces. Within the next 9 hours, over 6,000 soldiers would land on these beaches. Nearly 4,000 of them would never make it home. The raid on Dieppe would become one of the most controversial operations of the Second World War, a catastrophic failure that killed and captured thousands of young men, most of them Canadian. But the story of what really happened that day, and why Allied commanders sent these men into what many veterans would later call a slaughter, reveals uncomfortable truths about military planning, inter-Allied politics, and the brutal mathematics of learning warfare through blood. The idea for a large-scale raid on the French coast had been circulating through Allied command since the spring of 1942. Lieutenant General Bernard Montgomery, then commanding British Southeastern Command, initially championed an operation against Dieppe. The strategic logic seemed sound enough. The Soviet Union, bearing the crushing weight of the German war machine, desperately needed the Western Allies to open a second front. American commanders, flush with confidence after entering the war, pushed for immediate action against occupied Europe. British planners, more cautious after years of setbacks, wanted to test amphibious assault tactics before attempting anything larger. Dieppe, a port town on the Normandy coast approximately 170 kilometers north of Paris, seemed like the perfect target for what they called a large-scale raid. The plan that emerged was extraordinarily ambitious. Combined Operations Headquarters, led by Vice Admiral Lord Louis Mountbatten, designed Operation Rudder, later renamed Operation Jubilee after weather-forced postponements. The assault would involve nearly 5,000 soldiers from the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division, alongside approximately 1,000 British commandos and 50 American Rangers, gaining their first taste of combat in Europe. The Royal Navy would commit over 230 vessels, while the Royal Air Force planned the largest air operation since the Battle of Britain, committing nearly 70 squadrons. The objectives read like a wish list: destroy the port facilities, capture invasion barges, seize German code documents, assess German coastal defenses, boost Allied morale, and prove to Stalin that the Western Allies were serious about taking the fight to Hitler. Major General John Hamilton Roberts, commanding the 2nd Canadian Division, received orders for an operation unlike anything attempted before. The plan called for simultaneous landings at 5 different beaches, spread across a 16-kilometer front. 2 flank attacks by British commandos would silence heavy coastal batteries at Berneval to the east and Varennes-Javille to the west. The main Canadian force would land directly on Dieppe's seafront and in the town itself, while secondary landings at Puys to the east and Pourville to the west would secure the flanks and capture German positions on the surrounding headlands. The entire raid was supposed to last no more than 15 hours. The troops would withdraw before German reinforcements could arrive in strength. What the planners didn't know was that their plan contained fatal flaws from the very beginning. Intelligence about German defenses was incomplete, and in some cases dangerously wrong. Aerial reconnaissance photographs failed to reveal the full extent of fortifications that the Germans had been improving for 2 years. The cliffs overlooking the beaches, rising between 30 and 100 meters high in places, provided perfect defensive positions. The town of Dieppe itself sat in a natural amphitheater, with high ground on 3 sides. Any force landing on the beaches would be completely exposed, caught in a killing zone with nowhere to hide. Some officers who studied the plan expressed private doubts, but the pressure to act, to do something visible against the Germans, overrode caution. The decision to proceed without preliminary naval bombardment proved catastrophic. Planners feared that shelling the town would alert German defenses and destroy the port facilities they intended to capture intact. They also worried about civilian casualties in the occupied French town. Instead, they relied on surprise and on the Royal Air Force to suppress German positions with bombing and strafing runs. This was a gamble that would cost thousands of lives. The plan also assumed that Churchill tanks could drive across the beaches and up into the town. Engineers assured commanders that the shingle beaches, composed of smooth stones rather than sand, would support the weight of 40-ton tanks. They were wrong about that too. In the early morning darkness of August 19th, the invasion fleet crossed the English Channel, a vast armada of destroyers, landing craft, and support vessels spread across miles of water. At 3:47 a.m., roughly 13 kilometers off the French coast, the Eastern Assault Group ran directly into a small German coastal convoy. A fierce firefight erupted in the darkness, with tracer rounds lighting up the night and star shells turning the sea into harsh daylight. The engagement scattered the landing craft headed for Berneval. Some boats turned back, others lost formation in the confusion and smoke. The element of surprise, so critical to the entire operation, was already compromised. Lieutenant Colonel Lord Lovat's No. 4 Commando, approaching Varengeville to the west, encountered no such problems. At 4:50 a.m., his men landed smoothly on two beaches flanking the Hesse battery, 6 150mm guns positioned to dominate the approaches to Dieppe. Lovat split his force, sending one group to attack from inland while he led a frontal assault from the beach. The commandos moved with practiced precision through the morning twilight, using hedgerows and farm buildings for cover. At 6:30 a.m., exactly on schedule, both groups attacked simultaneously. In a textbook small unit action lasting 88 minutes, they destroyed the battery, killed most of the German garrison, and withdrew with only 12 casualties. It was the only unqualified success of the entire operation. Meanwhile, at Puys, 3 kilometers east of Dieppe, the Royal Regiment of Canada was approaching Blue Beach, a narrow strip of shingle barely 200 meters wide, hemmed in by high cliffs and a concrete seawall. The landing craft were already 7 minutes late, arriving at 5:07 a.m. in the growing light of dawn. German defenders of the 571st Infantry Regiment had been alerted by the naval battle offshore. As the first landing craft grounded on the stones, machine guns opened fire from positions on the cliff tops and from a pillbox at the eastern end of the beach. The Canadians stumbled across the loose stones under withering fire, unable to reach the seawall. Those who made it found themselves pinned down, unable to advance or retreat. Major batteries of mortars and artillery joined in, turning the beach into a killing ground. In less than 3 hours, the Royal Regiment suffered 227 killed and 264 captured out of 554 men who landed. Not a single man from Blue Beach reached the objective of securing the eastern headland. At Pourville, 4 kilometers west of Dieppe, the situation initially looked more promising. The South Saskatchewan Regiment and the Queen's Own Cameron Highlanders of Canada landed on Green Beach at 4:52 a.m., slightly ahead of schedule and before full daylight. They met lighter resistance and managed to push inland, crossing the Sai River and advancing toward the village. Lieutenant Colonel Cecil Merritt of the South Saskatchewans repeatedly led his men across a heavily defended bridge, waving his helmet and shouting encouragement while bullets kicked up spray around him. For this action, he would later receive the Victoria Cross. But as the morning progressed and the main assault on Dieppe failed to materialize as planned, the Germans reinforced their positions around Pourville. The Canadians found themselves cut off, unable to advance further, and eventually unable to retreat. The main assault on Dieppe itself began at 5:20 a.m. The Essex Scottish Regiment and the Royal Hamilton Light Infantry landed directly in front of the town on red and white beaches, narrow strips of shingle backed by a concrete esplanade and a high seawall. From the moment the landing craft ramps dropped, the troops came under intense fire from German positions on the headlands and from buildings overlooking the waterfront. The distinctive sound of MG-42 machine guns, capable of firing 200 rounds per minute, created what survivors described as a continuous ripping sound, like tearing fabric. Men fell in the shallow water, on the stones, against the seawall. Those who reached the esplanade found themselves trapped in the open, unable to advance through the narrow streets blocked by concrete obstacles and barbed wire. The supporting Churchill tanks of the 14th Canadian Army Tank Battalion began landing at 5:30 a.m. Of the 29 tanks that reached the beach, none made it off. The shingle stones jammed their tracks, disabled their steering systems, and brought them to helpless stops within meters of the water's edge. Some crews managed to maneuver along the esplanade, firing at German positions, but they could not climb the seawall or break through obstacles into the town. Trapped and immobilized, the tanks became stationary pillboxes, supporting the infantry as best they could, until German anti-tank guns destroyed them one by one. By 6:00 a.m., most of the tanks were burning wrecks or abandoned hulks. What the men on the beaches didn't know was that the raid had already failed. From his headquarters, ship HMS Calpe, offshore in the Channel, Major General Roberts struggled to understand what was happening. Radio communications were chaotic, with conflicting reports arriving through the smoke and noise of battle. Some messages suggested that troops had broken into the town. Others reported complete disaster. Roberts, trying to salvage something from the operation, committed his reserves. At 7 a.m., he ordered the Fusilier Mont Royal, his floating reserve, to land on Red Beach in front of Dieppe. It was a death sentence. The Fusiliers approached a beach already littered with dead and wounded, landing under the same murderous fire that had decimated the first wave. Within minutes of landing, the battalion ceased to exist as a fighting unit, with 119 killed and 244 captured. The reality proved very different from what the planners had envisioned. German defenders of the 302nd Infantry Division, far from being surprised and overwhelmed, fought with discipline and effectiveness. They had transformed Dieppe into a fortress, with interlocking fields of fire, reinforced concrete positions, and carefully prepared killing zones. Every window overlooking the beaches concealed machine guns. Every approach was covered by multiple weapons. The defenders had rehearsed their response to amphibious attack, and now they executed it with brutal efficiency. German artillery inland, including batteries that should have been neutralized by the commando raids but weren't, poured shells onto the beaches with devastating accuracy. By 9 a.m., the situation on all beaches except Varengeville was hopeless. At Puys, survivors huddled against the seawall, pinned down and taking casualties from mortar fire. At Pourville, the Canadians fought a desperate rearguard action trying to reach the evacuation beaches. On the main Dieppe beaches, wounded men lay exposed on the stones, while medics tried to help them under continuous fire. The Royal Navy destroyers offshore, including HMS Berkeley and HMS Albrighton, moved closer to shore, using their 4.7-inch guns to suppress German positions. But naval gunfire could not reach defenders in concrete bunkers or in the buildings of the town itself. The withdrawal order came at 9:40 a.m., but executing it proved nearly impossible. Landing craft had to approach beaches still under heavy fire to evacuate survivors. Many craft were hit and sunk before reaching shore. Others grounded and were abandoned. Some brave crews made multiple trips, rescuing as many men as they could. At Dieppe itself, the evacuation was chaotic and incomplete. Men waded into the water under fire, trying to reach the boats. Some drowned in deep water. Others were picked up only to die from their wounds before reaching England. Many more were left behind, either too badly wounded to move or unable to reach the boats before they pulled away. The last landing craft left Dieppe at approximately 1:30 p.m. the battle in the air above the beaches raged even longer. The Royal Air Force had committed nearly 70 squadrons to provide cover and support, the largest air operation since the Battle of Britain 2 years earlier. In fierce dogfights throughout the morning and afternoon, the RAF lost 106 aircraft, including 88 fighters and 10 bombers. The Luftwaffe lost 48 aircraft. For the first time since 1940, the Germans inflicted a decisive air victory over British skies. The promised air superiority that would protect the landing forces never materialized. The final butcher's bill shocked even hardened military commanders. Of the 4,163 Canadian soldiers who embarked for Dieppe, only 2,210 returned to England, and many of these were wounded. The 2nd Canadian Infantry Division suffered 3,367 casualties, including 916 killed and 1,946 captured. The Royal Navy lost 550 men killed or missing, with 1 destroyer sunk and 33 landing craft destroyed. The Royal Air Force's losses brought total Allied casualties to over 4,400 killed, wounded, or captured in a single 9-hour operation. German casualties totaled approximately 591 men, including 301 killed. The raid achieved none of its major objectives. The port facilities remained intact in German hands. No invasion barges were destroyed. No code documents were captured. The German coastal defenses, far from being assessed as vulnerable, proved devastatingly effective. In the immediate aftermath, shock and anger rippled through Canada. The nation had committed its troops to what many now openly called a massacre. Questions filled the Canadian Parliament and newspapers. Who authorized this raid? Why were Canadian troops chosen to bear the brunt of casualties? What military value justified such losses? The British government, acutely sensitive to Dominion relations, worked to control the narrative. Lord Mountbatten defended the operation, arguing that valuable lessons had been learned. Prime Minister Winston Churchill called it a reconnaissance in force, and insisted that the sacrifice had not been in vain. The lesson-learning justification would echo for decades, becoming the official explanation for the Dieppe disaster. Military planners indeed studied every aspect of the failed raid. They learned that frontal assaults on defended ports were suicidal. They learned that amphibious operations required massive preliminary bombardment, not surprise attacks. They learned that specialized equipment was essential, from better landing craft to obstacle-clearing tanks. They learned that coordination between air, sea, and land forces had to be far more sophisticated. They learned that intelligence about enemy defenses must be complete and accurate. When planning began for Operation Overlord, the Normandy invasion 2 years later, planners explicitly incorporated lessons from Dieppe. The Normandy landings avoided attacking a port directly, instead landing on open beaches. Massive naval and air bombardment preceded the assault. Specialized armor cleared obstacles. Every detail of German defenses was photographed and analyzed. But the question that haunts Dieppe is whether these lessons required such a catastrophic demonstration. Many of the principles learned at Dieppe were already known from earlier amphibious disasters, from Gallipoli in the First World War to the failed Dakar expedition in 1940. Some officers had warned that the plan was flawed, that attacking a defended port without preliminary bombardment was madness, that the intelligence was inadequate. These warnings were overridden by political pressure to act, by inter-allied competition, by the desire to be seen doing something against Germany in 1942. For years, this remained classified, but documents that emerged decades later revealed deeper complexities. Some historians have argued that Dieppe was partly a political operation, meant to demonstrate to Stalin and to the Americans that opening a second front in 1942 was premature and would end in disaster. Others have suggested that Dieppe was connected to intelligence operations, possibly involving attempts to capture or examine new German radar systems. Still others point to bureaucratic competition between combined operations and traditional military commands, with Mountbatten eager to prove the value of his organization. The truth likely involves all these factors: a perfect storm of political pressure, military rivalry, incomplete intelligence, and overconfidence that sent thousands of men into an unwinnable battle. The survivors carried their trauma for life. Lieutenant Colonel Cecil Merritt, the Victoria Cross recipient, spent 3 years in German prisoner of war camps. Many Dieppe veterans refused to speak about their experiences for decades. The memories too painful, the losses too great. Captain Dennis Whitaker of the Royal Hamilton Light Infantry, who survived the main beach assault, later wrote that, at Dieppe, we learned that even the best and bravest troops cannot overcome poor planning and faulty intelligence. Major Brian McCool, who watched his company of the Royal Regiment of Canada cut down on Blue Beach, carried survivor's guilt for the rest of his life, questioning why he lived when so many of his men died. The German perspective adds another dimension to the story. Major General Conrad Hasse, commanding the 302nd Infantry Division, received the Knight's Cross for his defense of Dieppe. German propaganda made much of the victory, using it to demonstrate the invulnerability of the Atlantic Wall. But some German officers privately expressed surprise at how poorly conceived the Allied attack had been. They had expected heavier preliminary bombardment, more sophisticated tactics, better coordination. The ease with which they repelled the raid gave some commanders dangerous overconfidence about German coastal defenses, a complacency that would be shattered on the beaches of Normandy 2 years later. In Dieppe today, the Canadian War Cemetery contains 707 graves, most from the 1942 raid. A memorial on the waterfront lists the names of the dead, overlooking the beaches where they fell. The casino building, which served as a German strongpoint and witnessed some of the fiercest fighting, still stands, now converted to a convention center. The shingle beaches remain, though seawalls and modern development have altered the coastline. Every year, on the 19th of August, Canadian veterans and their families gather in Dieppe for a memorial service, the numbers dwindling with each passing year, but the memory remaining sharp and painful. The 50 American Rangers who participated in the raid learned their own brutal lessons about amphibious warfare. 6 of them were killed or captured at Dieppe. The survivors took their experience to North Africa and later to Normandy, where Ranger battalions would scale the cliffs at Pointe du Hoc. The Rangers learned what the Canadians and British paid so dearly to teach: that courage alone cannot overcome poor planning, that bravery cannot substitute for adequate preparation, and that the lives of soldiers must never be squandered on operations that violate basic military principles. The tanks that reached Dieppe's beaches, immobilized and destroyed, taught engineers crucial lessons about beach obstacles and specialized armor. This led directly to the development of Hobart's funnies, the specialized tanks that cleared beaches on D-Day, from flail tanks that detonated mines to bridging tanks that crossed obstacles. The Churchill tanks at Dieppe failed, but their failure gave birth to the engineering solutions that helped Overlord succeed. The landing craft that struggled to evacuate troops under fire led to improved designs and tactics. The communication failures prompted complete overhauls of command and control systems. Every flaw exposed at Dieppe received attention and correction before Normandy. In a bizarre twist of fate, the very completeness of the disaster at Dieppe may have contributed to Allied victory in Normandy. The Germans, convinced by their success at Dieppe that Allied amphibious assaults could be defeated at the waterline, continued building fixed coastal fortifications rather than developing mobile reserves for counterattacks. They believed the Atlantic Wall was impregnable, a belief that Dieppe reinforced. When the Allies landed in Normandy on the 6th of June 1944, they brought overwhelming force, specialized equipment, and tactics refined through the blood sacrifice of Dieppe. The German defenders, expecting another Dieppe, found themselves facing an operation orders of magnitude larger and more sophisticated. Operation Jubilee, the raid on Dieppe, remains one of the most controversial Allied operations of World War II. It achieved none of its objectives and cost over 4,000 casualties in 9 hours. Whether those deaths purchased valuable lessons that saved lives on D-Day, or whether they were the result of flawed planning and political pressure, remains debated by historians. What cannot be disputed is the courage of the men who landed on those beaches, who advanced under impossible fire, who fought and died following orders that sent them into an unwinnable battle. The Canadians who died at Dieppe paid the blood price for lessons that helped win the war, but the question of whether that price needed to be so high, whether those lessons could have been learned another way, haunts the memory of that terrible August morning on the coast of France.